In the summer of 2003, the U.S. Army Special Forces team became the first Americans to meet with the elders of the Korangal Valley, an inaccessible, inhospitable, mountainous forest dotted with tiny logging villages carved out of the mountainside. The team's commander explained why they had trekked up the treacherous valley. An Afghan police official had complained that the Korangalis had attacked him when he visited the valley the week earlier to collect taxes and to warn them about a recent ban by the national government that prohibited them from cutting down trees. Now, the next part of the story took a long time to put together. In fact, when I went to the Korangal Valley 5 years later, we still didn't have all the details. They really only emerged throughout the course of our war in Afghanistan. Because unbeknownst to that Special Forces team, practically everyone in the Korangal Valley was a logger. The national ban against logging would deprive them of their only livelihood. And meanwhile, the police official who had visited the week prior, he didn't visit to enforce the national logging ban. He had visited to increase the bribe that he charged the Korangalis in order to get their timber across the border to Pakistan for sale. Furious with their government's attempts to outlaw their trade, and pretty upset with the U.S. soldiers' support of a corrupt official, the Korangalis turned to the Taliban for help. And in short order, the Korangal Valley became home to the fiercest fighting waged throughout more than 20 years of war in Afghanistan, resulting in 54 American deaths, billions of dollars in ammunition and materiel, and an embarrassing retreat in 2011 that provided the Taliban with a stranglehold on northern Afghanistan that they would exploit to obtain victory more than 10 years later. Now, on its surface, Korangali resistance against Afghan and American forces seemed eminently reasonable. There are even echoes of the American Revolution in its rejection of corruption and government overreach. But deep down, the situation was quite a bit murkier. In both its aims and its tactics, Korangali resistance showed little regard for human life, liberty, or dignity. Seldom did the Korangalis attack without using women or children as shields. And the Taliban made natural partners for the Korangalis, who didn't just resist their government's interference in the timber trade, but also their attempts to send girls to school, to put an end to forced marriages, and to halt sex trafficking. The situation in the Korangal illustrates how easy it can be to confuse those acts of civil disobedience which should engender our sympathies with those that should engender our condemnation or opposition. And this matters, not just because we're a nation founded upon civil unrest, which we are, but because nearly every act of civil disobedience, legitimate or illegitimate, clothes itself in the seductive language of liberty and freedom. From Russian forces seeking to liberate the citizens of Ukraine, to Hamas forces protesting Israeli occupation forces with indiscriminate rocket fire, to dissidents seeking to overturn elections in the United States, in Brazil, in Peru, to insurgents fighting against government overreach into their commercial and religious lives. Everyone says that they're fighting against injustice. Everyone says that they're fighting for freedom. So how do we know? How do we determine when the defiance of law is just or unjust? Thankfully, our tradition provides us with some measure of guidance for choosing when to support and when to oppose acts of civil disobedience. Because in this week's Parsha, Shemot, we have 3 acts of resistance aimed against the Egyptian regime. In the first, 2 midwives, Shifra and Puah, refuse to do the bidding of the Pharaoh when he demands that they kill Hebrew boys at birth. Instead, they refuse. They safeguard the Hebrew babies, and they lie to the Pharaoh, informing him that Hebrew mothers always deliver before the midwives can arrive, and thus there was no way for them to carry out their orders. In the second act of resistance, Pharaoh's own daughter rescues a Hebrew baby from the river and raises him as her own, in direct defiance of her own father's orders. And finally, in the third act of defiance, Moses strikes down an Egyptian slaver to stop him from beating a Hebrew slave. Each of these acts of disobedience portrays someone defying an unjust law that specifically jeopardizes the lives of Hebrews. And through their defiance, Shifra, Puah, Pharaoh's daughter, and Moses all deliver potential victims from the harm intended by Pharaoh's decrees. As the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King taught from his prison cell in Birmingham, any law that uplifts human personality is just, but any law that degrades human personality is unjust. All segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority and the segregated a false sense of inferiority. Segregation, to use the terminology of Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, substitutes an I-it relationship for what should be an I-thou relationship. It relegates persons to the status of things. And so segregation is not only politically, economically, and sociologically unsound, it is morally wrong. It is a sin. Seeking justice then means seeking to promote human life and liberty for all peoples. Those who defy the law to safeguard the lives, the liberties, and the dignities of others, like Shifra, like Puah, like the Pharaoh's daughter, like Moses, seek justice and deserve our support. But those who defy the law with the intent to impress innocents, to deprive them of their human dignities, even in the name of freedom, they do not seek justice, nor do they deserve our sympathies. Meanwhile, each episode of disobedience in this week's Parsha, we find that not just the ends, but also the means of resisting seek to uphold human life. Even though in one episode Moses employs violence to achieve his ends, Moses only endeavors to save his fellow Hebrew from immediate harm and only targets the perpetrator, not innocents. And from this we learn that violence can never achieve justice. It can only defend the victims of injustice when used appropriately. Dr. King cautions us similarly in his speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. In the process of gaining our rightful place, we cannot be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. We must not allow our creative protest to degenerate into physical violence. Seeking justice then means promoting human life and liberty, not just in our aims, but also in our actions. Those who deliberately place the lives and the liberties of innocents at risk to achieve their goals, they do not seek justice. They, like those who create unjust laws or seek unjust aims, relegate persons to the status of things. Because true justice seeks to safeguard the lives of all human beings, not a select few. True justice seeks to give all people a voice, not just a select few. True justice seeks to grant all people freedom, not just a select few. For in true justice, there is no distinction among us, black or white, boy or girl or neutral, migrant or native, rich or poor, Jew or Christian or Muslim. We are, all of us, God's children, and the justice we are commanded to pursue must benefit us all, or it will only injure us all. As far as the fighters in the Korangal Valley were concerned, their cause was just. They were reacting to government overreach into their commercial and religious lives. But their willingness to jeopardize the lives of innocents for their cause, their insistence that religious freedom meant the privilege of oppressing young girls and women in their midst, reveals a disheartening truth. Not every freedom fighter is really fighting for freedom, and the world is a more unjust place for their success. It remains for us then to ensure that their mockery of justice is given no safe haven to spread in this country or beyond, and to remind ourselves, in the words of Dr. King, that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, that we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny, that whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Thus do we glimpse the path towards justice more clearly, the path that promises life, liberty, and dignity for us all. Shabbat Shalom.